the scream that tore through the stagnant, dust-choked air of Pinewood Studios on that grey, oppressive Tuesday in the summer of 1957, was not merely a sound of human anger, it was the sonic boom of two tectonic plates colliding, a violent, irreversible rupture in the history of cinema that would echo long after the final credits of The Prince and the Showgirl had rolled and the reels were locked away in the vault. To truly understand the gravity of that scream, to feel the crushing weight of the silence that followed it, one must first step out of the comfort of the present day and immerse oneself in the suffocating, poisonous atmosphere of Stage D. It was a time when London was still shaking off the soot, the rubble, and the trauma of the Second World War. A city of grey rain, ration books, and stiff upper lips, colliding head-on with the technicolor glitter, the excess, and the unapologetic vulnerability of American celebrity. And at the absolute epicenter of this cultural earthquake stood two figures who represented opposing poles of human existence, two deities of the screen engaged in a silent war for the soul of the production. On one side, dominating the room with a terrifying Shakespearean charisma, was Sir Laurence Olivier. He was not just a director, and he was not just an actor. He was an institution, a national monument carved from flesh and blood. He was the knight of the British realm, the living embodiment of the classical tradition, a man who believed with religious fervor that acting was a discipline of iron will, vocal precision, and absolute, unquestioning obedience to the text. To him, the film set was not a playground for emotions. It was a military parade ground, and he was the commander-in-chief. He stood in the center of the set like a vengeful Old Testament god, his face contorted into a mask of purple rage, his veins bulging against the starch of his pristine collar, pointing a trembling accusatory finger at the floor. And at the end of that finger, cowering like a wounded animal caught in the high beams of a truck, was not a fellow star, not a producer who could fight back, but a 62-year-old woman named Elspeth. Elspeth was a wardrobe assistant, a utility hand, a woman who had spent 4 decades in the shadows, pinning hems, ironing pleats, and fading into the background so that the stars could shine. But today she was not invisible. Today she was the target of a fury so disproportionate, so cruel, and so public that it frozen the blood of every technician, every extra, and every bystander in the room. The word fired left Olivier's lips with the force of a cannonball, shattering the fragile ecosystem of the set, bouncing off the wooden rafters, and settling like a death sentence upon the shoulders of the weeping woman. Security guards, men conditioned to obey authority without question, began to move from the shadows of the soundstage, their footsteps heavy and ominous on the wooden floorboards, ready to escort this grandmotherly figure out into the unforgiving grey drizzle of the English afternoon. The crew looked away. They studied their shoes, they examined their camera lenses with intense fascination, they adjusted lights that didn't need adjusting, doing anything, absolutely anything, to avoid witnessing the humiliation of a woman who was, by all accounts, one of them. It was a scene of absolute tyranny, a stark and brutal reminder that in the golden age of Hollywood and the prestigious halls of British cinema, the little people were merely expendable fuel for the engines of genius, casualties of war in the pursuit of art. But then, an anomaly occurred, a glitch in the matrix of power. A voice cut through the thick tension, soft as velvet but harder than diamond, sharper than a scalpel. It was not a shout, it was not a plea. It was a command wrapped in a whisper. Marilyn Monroe, the woman the world had dismissed as a breathy caricature, the woman Olivier himself had mocked behind closed doors as a confused amateur and a vulgar American tourist, stepped out of her meticulously lit mark. She broke the cardinal rule of the set, she crossed the line. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace that defied the chaos around her, she positioned her body between the advancing security guards and the trembling seamstress, creating a physical shield with her own frame. She looked up at the knighted legend, her blue eyes devoid of the usual camera-ready sparkle, replaced by a cold, steely resolve that no photographer had ever captured. "If she goes," Marilyn said, her voice steady, devoid of the stutter that often plagued her when she was nervous, "I go." She reached for the zipper of her dress, the intricate, expensive white chiffon costume that had taken 3 hours to fit, and began to pull it down. "And you can film your masterpiece without me." This was not a tantrum, this was a coup d'etat. This was the moment the immovable object met the unstoppable force. To fully grasp why this moment was so impossible, so earth-shattering, we must rewind the clock and dive deep into the context of this production, peeling back the layers of glamour to reveal the rot underneath. It was 1957. Marilyn Monroe had arrived in London not as a conqueror, but as a refugee seeking sanctuary from her own fame. She had recently formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, a radical and dangerous move for a woman in the 1950s who was expected to be seen and not heard, a body without a brain. She had come to England to prove to the world, and perhaps to herself, that she was more than just a calendar girl, more than just a joke for late-night comedians. She wanted to be an artist. She had been studying with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York. She was diving deep into the method, a controversial style of acting that required digging into one's own trauma, one's own sensory memories, to find emotional truth. Laurence Olivier, however, despised this. To him, the method was self-indulgent nonsense, a degradation of the craft. He famously asked Dustin Hoffman years later, "Why don't you just act, dear boy?" To Olivier, Marilyn's constant lateness, her need for emotional preparation, her acting coach Paula Strasberg hovering on set like a dark shadow in widow's weeds, was a personal insult to the profession he revered. He viewed her as an unruly child who needed to be broken, a wild horse that needed to be saddled. He didn't understand her anxiety, he only saw her unprofessionalism. The set of The Prince and the Showgirl had become a battlefield of ideologies, a clash between the rigid discipline of the British aristocracy and the raw, messy emotion of American modernism. The heat was suffocating, amplified by the massive arc lights required for the Technicolor film stock, baking the soundstage to tropical temperatures. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, melting grease paint, and fear. Every member of the crew was on edge, terrified of Olivier's legendary temper, which could snap like a whip at the slightest provocation. Marilyn was isolated. She was trapped in a foreign country, surrounded by people who spoke the same language but meant entirely different things. Her new marriage to playwright Arthur Miller was already beginning to show hairline fractures, the intellectual giant growing distant from his emotional wife. Her mind was plagued by crippling insecurities, by the ghost of her mother's madness, by the fear that she was exactly what the critics said she was, a fraud. She was taking barbiturates to sleep, stimulants to wake up, and champagne to numb the hours in between. She was the most famous woman on the planet, adored by millions, yet in that cavernous studio, surrounded by a British crew that viewed her with suspicion and disdain, she was completely, utterly alone. She was a woman on the verge of a breakdown, holding herself together with sheer willpower and the adhesive of her public persona, except for Elspeth. Elspeth was part of the invisible army that kept the film industry running, the seamstresses, the carpenters, the cleaners, the electricians. She was a widow from the East End of London, a woman whose life story was etched into the deep lines of her face and the rough texture of her hands. She had survived the Blitz. She had huddled in underground stations while the Luftwaffe rained fire upon her neighborhood, listening to the screams of falling bombs, wondering if the roof would cave in. She had known hunger. She had known the bitter cold of a coalless winter. She had known loss, the telegrams, the empty chairs at the table, and now she knew fear of a different kind. Her hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in the dark during an air raid blackout, had begun to betray her. A tremor, slight at first, barely noticeable, but growing worse with stress, growing worse with the damp cold of the studio. Was it Parkinson's? Was it just nerves? Was it the exhaustion of 60 years of hard labor? It didn't matter. In an industry that demanded absolute perfection, a shaking hand was a liability. It was a firing offense. Elspeth hid it as best she could, jamming her hands into her apron pockets whenever a supervisor walked by, praying every morning to a god she wasn't sure was listening that she could get through one more day, earn one more paycheck to keep the heating on in her small, drafty flat in Hackney. She needed this job. It wasn't about fame for her, it was about survival. On that fateful Tuesday, the pressure was at its absolute zenith. They were filming the grand ballroom sequence. The logistics were a nightmare. Hundreds of extras in period costume, complex camera cranes moving on tracks like predatory beasts, and a lighting setup that took 4 hours to align. Olivier was already in a foul mood, his patience eroded by Marilyn's anxiety-induced delays and the technical difficulties of the shot. He had been shouting since 6 a.m. The air was thick with tension, a spark away from an explosion. When they finally rolled camera for the 20th take, the silence on set was not peaceful, it was terrified. It was the silence of a bomb squad waiting for a wire to be cut. A church-like silence, the press notes would later call it. You could hear a heartbeat, you could hear the dust settle, and in that vast, echoing mausoleum of silence, tragedy struck in the form of a tiny metallic object, a pin. Elspeth, kneeling at Marilyn's feet to adjust the hem of the white chiffon gown for the final check, felt a sudden, violent spasm in her hand. The silver pin slipped from her fingers. Time seemed to slow down. The pin tumbled through the air, catching the light of the 10K arc lamp, spinning end over end. It hit the polished wooden floor with a ting that, in the amplified acoustics of the quiet studio, sounded like a gunshot. It was a microscopic sound, but it carried the weight of doom. In her sheer panic to retrieve it before anyone noticed, Elspeth lunged forward, her fingers clumsy with fear, and the unthinkable happened. The sharp point of the pin caught the delicate gossamer fabric of the dress. Rip! The sound of tearing silk was deafening. It was the sound of money burning. It was the sound of a career ending. The illusion was broken. The take was ruined, and Olivier exploded. He didn't just yell, he annihilated her. He marched over, towering over the kneeling woman, unleashing a torrent of abuse that stripped her of every shred of dignity she had managed to hold onto through wars and poverty. He called her incompetent. He called her stupid. He called her a clumsy oaf who had no business breathing the same air as professional artists. "Get her out of my sight," he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his own theatrical projection. "Fire her. Get me someone who can actually hold a needle without shaking like a leaf. Now. Out." The cruelty was precise. He attacked the one thing she couldn't control, her shaking hands. Elspeth collapsed inward, sobbing into her hands, her body shaking so violently it looked as if she were having a seizure. She began to gather her small tin of needles, dropping them in her haste, making it worse, a portrait of utter defeat. She stood up, her knees knocking together, and turned to walk the long, lonely path to the exit doors, the walk of shame that would end her career and likely send her into destitution. The crew watched in silence, paralyzed by the hierarchy, paralyzed by the fear that if they spoke up they would be next. But she never reached the door. Marilyn Monroe, the woman who was supposedly too drugged, too distracted, and too self-absorbed to notice anything, saw everything. She saw the tremor in Elspeth's hands because she recognized it. She saw the terror in Elspeth's eyes because she saw it in the mirror every single morning. In a split second, the dumb blonde mask fell away. The manufactured persona dissolved. Marilyn moved with the ferocity of a lioness protecting a cub. She intercepted the security team, stepping in front of Elspeth, blocking their path with her body. She grabbed the older woman's shaking hand with a grip that was shockingly strong, warm and real. "Wait," she commanded. Her voice echoed off the soundproofing, cutting through the murmurs. Olivier laughed, a cruel, dry sound that lacked any humor. "My dear, don't be dramatic," he sneered, checking his pocket watch. "We are losing light. Let the woman go. We will find a replacement within the hour. Someone competent." Marilyn turned to him, and witnesses say the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She didn't blink. She didn't look for approval from her acting coach. She didn't look at her husband. She looked directly at the most powerful man in British theatre, and she didn't see a knight. She saw a bully. "She stays," Marilyn said, her voice dropping an octave to her natural register, the voice of Norma Jean Baker, the orphan, the factory worker, the survivor who had scrubbed floors and tightened screws before the world knew her name. "Or I walk, and you can explain to the studio and the press and the investors why their star just walked out the door." The threat hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. She was gambling everything on kindness. The silence that followed Marilyn's ultimatum was heavier, denser, and more terrifying than the silence that had preceded it. It hung in the air like the smoke after a bombing raid, a physical weight pressing down on the chest of every person in Stage D. It was a silence so profound that you could hear the carbon rods in the arc lights sizzling, a sound usually drowned out by the chaos of production. Sir Laurence Olivier stared at her, his eyes narrowing into slits, assessing her resolve with the cold calculation of a chess grandmaster. He looked for the crack in her armor, the hesitation in her posture, the slight tremble of a bluff behind those famous blue eyes. He was accustomed to actors crumbling under his gaze. He was accustomed to winning every battle of wills he had ever entered, but he found no crack. For the first time in the production, perhaps for the first time in his illustrious and decorated career, he realized with a visceral shock that he was not in control. He realized that this silly American girl, this product of the studio system he so despised, was holding a grenade and was perfectly willing to pull the pin. She was ready to burn the entire production to the ground. She was ready to risk lawsuits from Warner Brothers, risk her reputation in the international press, risk millions of dollars in production costs, all for a wardrobe assistant whose name he didn't even know, a woman he viewed as nothing more than animated furniture. The producers, watching from the high gantry above like vultures, held their breath. They knew what Olivier didn't want to admit. Marilyn was the franchise. Without her, there was no movie, only a very expensive collection of costumes and sets. The power dynamic of the set shifted in a heartbeat. Olivier, a pragmatist at his core who understood the brutality of the bottom line as well as the poetry of the bard, performed a rapid mental calculation. If he fired Marilyn, or if she walked, the insurance wouldn't cover it. His production company would face financial ruin. He knew when he was beaten. He let out a sharp, frustrated breath through his nose, a sound like escaping steam, waved a dismissive hand as if swatting away a troublesome fly, and turned his back on her to hide the flash of defeat in his eyes. "Fine," he spat, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Take 5, clear the set, fix the dress." It was a retreat, thinly veiled as a command, a face-saving gesture from a king who had just been checkmated by a pawn. The crew, sensing the danger had passed but the tension remained, began to exhale, moving quietly to the edges of the soundstage like receding tidewater. But Marilyn didn't retreat to her luxury trailer to escape the heat and the stares. She didn't call her agent to gloat about her victory. She didn't demand a fresh glass of champagne to celebrate or a pill to calm her nerves. She did something that baffled the British crew, something that went against every written and unwritten rule of the Hollywood star system. She pulled a rough wooden apple crate into the center of the stage, right there amidst the tangle of high-voltage cables and the blinding glare of the 10K lights, and she sat down. Not alone, but next to Elspeth. She signaled to her assistant, not for a script, not for a mirror to check her makeup, but for water. She took a clean monogrammed linen handkerchief from her sleeve, a prop meant for the scene, costing more than Elspeth's weekly wage, and began to wipe the tears and the smudged mascara from the older woman's face. She did this with a tenderness that was shocking in its intimacy, disregarding the frantic makeup artist who tried to intervene to touch up Marilyn's own face. "I'm so sorry, Miss Monroe," Elspeth wept, her voice trembling, her body still racked with the aftershocks of adrenaline. She couldn't look the star in the eye. She was staring at her own worn shoes, ashamed of her weakness, ashamed of her poverty, feeling the ghosts of the Blitz rising in her throat, that old familiar feeling of being small under a falling sky. "My hands, I get so nervous. He scares me so much. I didn't mean to ruin it. I didn't mean to cause trouble." And this is the moment where the legend transforms into something profoundly human, the moment that elevates this story from a mere anecdote to a parable of empathy. Marilyn leaned in close, creating a private sanctuary in the middle of that crowded hostel room. She ignored the hundreds of eyes watching them, the whispers of the crew, the ticking of the studio clock that burned money with every second. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and nervous sweat, a mix of glamour and humanity. She whispered, "He scares me too, Elspeth. Look." Marilyn held out her own hands. She placed them palm up on her lap, against the white chiffon of the dress. And there it was. The icon, the goddess, the fantasy of millions, the woman who smiled from every billboard in London, was shaking. Her hands were trembling just as violently as the seamstress's. The tremor was unmistakable, a rhythmic shudder that traveled from her fingers to her wrists. It was the physical manifestation of the terror she carried inside her every single day, the vibration of a soul stretched too thin. "I throw up before every scene," Marilyn confessed, sharing a vulnerability she usually hid deep behind the high walls of her mansion and the layers of her Max Factor makeup. "I stand in the wings and I can't breathe. My heart hammers against my ribs like a trapped bird. I forget my lines because I'm terrified I'm not good enough for him. I'm terrified they'll find out I'm a fraud, that I'm just Norma Jean from the orphanage wearing a costume. We are the same, you and I, just two girls trying to survive the wolves." It was a moment of radical equalization. With those few sentences, Marilyn stripped away the hierarchy of the studio system. She didn't act like a savior bestowing charity upon a peasant. She acted like a sister in the trenches, sharing war stories to keep the fear at bay. She validated Elspeth's fear, not by dismissing it, "Oh, don't worry about him, he's harmless," but by sharing it, "I feel it too, it's real." Marilyn then took charge of the situation with a practical tenderness that showed her true intelligence, an emotional intelligence that Olivier lacked. She called the makeup department over with a sharp snap of her fingers. "Fix her face," she ordered, pointing to Elspeth. The makeup artist hesitated, confused, his brush hovering over Marilyn. "But Miss Monroe, your lipstick." Marilyn cut him off with a look that could melt steel. "Powder her nose, make her look beautiful. She's part of the team. And bring her water, ice water." She then turned to the prop master who was watching from the shadows. "Bring a chair, a real chair with a back, not a stool." She insisted that from now on, Elspeth would sit during takes, not kneel on the hard floor. "Her knees are bad," Marilyn declared, inventing a medical condition on the spot to protect Elspeth's dignity, giving her a valid excuse to sit without looking lazy in front of the union bosses. She waited until Elspeth had stopped crying, until she had drunk the glass of water, until her breathing had slowed to a natural rhythm. She waited until the humanity had returned to the room, until Elspeth sat straighter, her dignity restored by the protection of the alpha female. Then, and only then, did Marilyn stand up, smooth the torn fabric of her dress which Elspeth had pinned with temporary grace, and turn to the fuming director who was pacing in the shadows like a caged tiger. "We are ready now, Larry." The rest of the shoot was different. The atmosphere had changed. The toxicity didn't vanish. Olivier was still Olivier, demanding, cold and critical, but Elspeth was now untouchable. She remained on the payroll. She wasn't fired. She wasn't shouted at again. And a secret language developed between the star and the seamstress, a conspiracy of kindness. Whenever Olivier would begin his tirades, whenever the tension would spike, whenever the atmosphere would grow toxic enough to choke on, Marilyn would catch Elspeth's eye across the shadowy set. She would offer a small, almost imperceptible wink, a signal, a code. "I've got you. We are in this together. He's just a man with a loud voice." That evening, when the studio whistle blew, Elspeth didn't just walk out, she floated. She took the bus back to Hackney, through the grey drizzle of London, clutching her handbag tight. Inside that bag, wrapped in a scrap of tissue paper, was the pin. When she opened the door to her small cold flat, she didn't feel the usual weight of loneliness. She felt seen. Marilyn Monroe left England shortly after, leaving behind a mixed critical reception, but a crew that secretly adored her. She returned to Hollywood, to the crumbling marriage with Arthur Miller, to the pills that numbed the pain, to the darkness that encroached on the edges of her life. She died tragically young, just 5 years later, in August 1962. She was consumed by the very darkness, the very fears, and the very loneliness she fought so hard to keep at bay. The world mourned the loss of a sex symbol, a movie star, a legend. Obituaries were written about her films, her failed marriages to baseball stars and playwrights, her dresses, her scandals. The world talked about the tragedy of her death, the mystery of the empty pill bottle. But in a small, damp flat in East London, far away from the flashing bulbs of Hollywood, an elderly woman sat by her wireless radio, listening to the BBC News, and wept for a friend. Elspeth lived to be 89 years old. She never gave interviews. She never sold her story to the tabloids, though she could have made a small fortune selling the true story of Marilyn's meltdown. She refused to monetize the kindness of a stranger. She lived a quiet life, surviving on her pension and her memories. Her granddaughter later revealed in a personal family memoir that Elspeth could never bear to watch Marilyn's movies on television. It hurt too much. It hurt to see the woman who had saved her life reduced to a two-dimensional image on a screen, misunderstood by the masses, laughed at for being the dumb blonde when Elspeth knew she was the smartest woman in the room. But Elspeth kept a memento, pinned to the inside lining of her heavy grey winter coat, hidden against her heart where no one else could see it, was a simple pearl-headed pin. The very pin she had dropped that day. It wasn't a badge of shame, it was a medal of honor. It was a reminder of the day a giant had stopped the world to help an ant. She used to tell her family, in quiet moments by the fire, holding that pin between her fingers, the strongest woman I ever met wasn't the one who shouted the loudest. It wasn't the one who commanded armies or ran studios. It was the one who held my hand when I was shaking. It was the one who admitted she was scared too. History likes to paint Marilyn Monroe as a victim, a tragic figure used and discarded by the machinery of Hollywood, a cautionary tale of fame destroying the soul. And in many ways she was. But we must rewrite that narrative. We must expand the frame to include moments like these. On that day, in that cold, hostile studio in London, Marilyn Monroe was not a victim. She was a hero. She wielded her power not to destroy, but to protect. She showed us that true strength is not about domination. It is about empathy. It is about looking at the person the world has decided is invisible, the cleaner, the server, the assistant, the seamstress, and saying, I see you. That is the untold legacy of Marilyn Monroe. Not the white dress blowing up over a subway grate, not the diamonds, not the happy birthday song, but the radical kindness she showed to a stranger when the cameras weren't rolling. That is the story that deserves to be told. That is the legend that should never die. And perhaps if we listen closely enough to the silence of history, past the noise of the headlines and the gossip, we can still hear that whisper, louder than any scream, echoing through the rafters of Pinewood Studios. If she goes, I go. It is a reminder to us all, when you have power, build a longer table, not a higher fence. Be the one who stops the scene. Be the one who picks up the pin.